Okay, so just a little bit about me. Again, I'm super happy to have the opportunity to talk to you all about this. I am an extension forestry and research specialist with the University of Illinois. And with that, I get to do um, a lot of work working with private landowners, working with agencies, and just a lot of different folks to try to help them manage their forest, keep it healthy, keep it sustainable, all of that. And it's really a wonderful job, right? I get to talk to folks like you all, and I really love talking to Wildland groups, Native Plant Society groups, Sierra Club, Audubon, these groups that are full of volunteers that just want to do good work either on their own land or on public land that they're volunteering on there, and then just enthusiasts for our nature. And so I call myself or consider myself right in there as well. I have been the president of the Southern chapter of the Native Plant Society in Illinois as well. And then I've really spent a lot of my career doing invasive plant stuff. And so I did my thesis work in Iowa, looking at buckthorn and honeysuckle, and then did a lot of work down in Georgia for a while, and made my way to Illinois in 2007. So I've been here for a while, but I'm in the far opposite end of the state. So I'm all the way down, just adjacent to the Ohio River, about 15 minutes from Kentucky, although I do cover a lot of the state. So what I wanted to do today really is talk about controlling invasive plants, but also just some invasive plant stuff in general. You're a little bit of preaching to the choir when it comes to invasive plants in terms of why they're a problem. But I think it's useful to talk about invasive plants and what I see as some of the problems with them. I think that's a great way to start. And then kind of talk about like this wildland urban interface, or this area where we have wildlands and nature adjacent to residential properties and places where we live, and this interaction between the wildlands and then the more manicured lands. It gives us some specific issues with invasive species. So I'm going to talk about that and then get into the meat of actually controlling these invasive species. What are our options and our techniques? And I'm going to move pretty fast because I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions, and I got a whole lot of slides. So when I talk about invasive species, I almost always start with this slide, just so we all kind of on the same page, because I hear the term invasive species thrown around a whole lot, and different people consider different things to be invasive. So this is the definition that I really use when I'm talking about an invasive, and I think it's useful to kind of lay that out. When I'm talking about an invasive species, it's really something that's not native to that ecosystem. It wasn't naturally found in that ecosystem. It didn't migrate on its own. It's just not a normal part of that ecosystem, but it has now escaped and then naturalized, which means it's formed these kind of free living populations where it's taking care of itself. And this could be insects, plants, it doesn't matter. It's kind of all taxa. But the fact that it's not native to that ecosystem and now it's in there and has a self-sustaining population, and that population has to grow to some level that there's a negative consequence for the fact that it's now in that ecosystem. It disrupts, or at least has a strong potential to disrupt our natural communities, our ecological functions, some kind of negative change, some change that we deem as negative. That's as a result of that species now being on the landscape, and we call that damage, right? Any kind of these negative changes we consider damage. And you all are really familiar with a lot of the common invaders up in northern Illinois, right? So we have things like garlic mustard, super common out there, really causing a lot of damage in terms of competing with our native spring wildflower flora, impacting forage and nectar availability in our forest. Amur honeysuckle, or also called bush honeysuckle. This is a species that I usually call one of the worst invasive species in Illinois in terms of our forest. Can really compete well with just about anything in the forest. And the thing I think the reason I think it's so bad is that it can invade even really high quality intact forests and start causing some serious changes. But others, tree of heaven, right? So tree of heaven is widely escaped, found in every county in the state. and then just as difficult to get rid of once it's in place. And that's why it really is a challenge. And one of the worst invasives is that it gets a foothold and it's hard to get rid of. But there's others, right? Leafy spurge has some toxicity to it, really moves into prairies and waste areas as well. And no list would be complete without the buckthorns, of course, right? So common buckthorn, one of the most abundant invaders in the northern tiers of county in Illinois, and then its cousin, glossy buckthorn. So before the meeting, we were talking, and I am fortunate in southern Illinois that we actually don't have the invasive buckthorns, which is kind of nice for us. What we do have is a native buckthorn, same genus. It's some people call it rhamnus, and other people put it in the frangula genus. But it's Carolina buckthorn, which is a native and kind of rare in southern Illinois. Beautiful plant. So it's kind of neat that we're trying to conserve and promote one native buckthorn down here, and then we don't have to deal with some of these invasive buckthorns like unfortunately you all do. Purple loosestrife, that one was really bad for a while and has kind of waned a little bit, but certainly there in one of our wetland species. And I kind of chose these species to show that invasives are a problem really in any ecosystem, right? Forest, prairies, wetlands, kind of all these systems have their own problems with invasive species. And there's a lot of impacts with these invaders. And again, you all know all this, but we often deal with multiple invasive species at one time, and we see big alterations, big changes to our ecosystems as a result of these species. And one that's not a plant but worth talking about and that we're all familiar with is emerald ash borer, right? And so this is a stand in a natural forest that was dominated by green ash here in Illinois that was absolutely decimated right after emerald ash borer came in and removed 80+% of the tree species in there, and then allowed all this extra light, and then multiflora rose and other invasive plants moved in. But we're basically losing an entire genus of trees out of the state of Illinois because of an invasive species, right? And so that's some pretty serious impacts. We see similar impacts in terms of scale into some of these invasive plants. Bush honeysuckle, again, leads to the decline in the growth rate of trees, sometimes by up to 50%, and then really a near complete loss of any tree seedling establishment or any herbaceous layer to some of the forests in these heavy stands. And this is a stand in central Illinois, this picture, and I'm showing what's growing underneath of the honeysuckle. And you can see it's a whole lot of bare dirt, a little bit of Virginia creeper, and then some younger honeysuckle, right? It just, this stand was a riverine system, and it should be chocked full of native vegetation at that time of year. I took this picture, but it's basically devoid of anything living in there due to the dense layer of honeysuckle above it. And then sometimes they can just impact what we can do to our land, right? So this is autumn olive. It forms dense thickets at such levels that sometimes it's hard to even walk through your woods. So if you're somebody that wants to bird watch, hunt mushrooms, or just hike and otherwise enjoy your woods, some of these invasives can alter your ability to do that, whether that's public land or private land, either one. Garlic mustard, unpalatable, as I mentioned earlier, to most wildlife, and it replaces the native species in the either nectar sources or food sources in our understory. It replaces them with something that's largely unpalatable, and not much uses it as a nectar source. And so you go from having a rich, diverse ecosystem that feeds and provides habitat for suites of native insects and other macroinvertebrates to an ecosystem that's dominated by one species that nothing uses, right? And so it's a real drastic change. And then just two more of these. I know this is kind of gloom and doom stuff here, but roundleaf bittersweet is a direct attacker of our trees. It can climb up into our trees, wrap around them, and so aggressively that it literally pulls down their branches or breaks the trees, makes them susceptible to wind throw or ice storms, or just shades them out, right? And so this is some like kind of direct plant on plant impacts. And then we see with these plants, we get these kind of trophic cascade or these impacts that go beyond just plant diversity. And so we see large scale wildlife impacts sometimes. And there's been some neat research out there with exotic shrubs showing that they can drastically increase nest predation for bird species simply because they tend to branch a little lower down to the ground. And so the shrub nesting birds, their nests are a little more vulnerable to predation from rat snakes or raccoons. The leaves can alter the water chemistry in streams, and that can change the food sources, the insect population, and then obviously the fish population. And then one really interesting study looked at how some of these plants, like honeysuckle, have a real early leaf phenology, which means they leaf out earlier in the spring and stay green later in the fall than most of our native shrubs, and how that has changed the climate conditions in these forests in the early spring that were vital habitat for reptile species, mostly snakes. In this study, the snakes would come out and then bask in the sun on warm days in the spring when they had full light because none of our natives were leafed out at that time. And now they're coming out to bask in the sun, and the honeysuckle's already leafed out and occupying that sunshine. And so they're finding that they can't um, thermoregulate as easily in the spring simply because they can't get access to sunlight. Really, really interesting and unfortunate impacts that we're seeing from these invasive species kind of at multiple levels across the ecosystem. And so because of all of this, we manage these invasive species. We want to control them. We want to reduce these impacts. We want to promote our native species, right? And so we're seeing, as we're just managing our native ecosystems, so if we're a forest preserve or DNR land or something, we have a nature preserve on site, we want to do steps to manage these ecosystems, and we want to um, protect them. We have certain goals. And so if you're managing a natural community, you're managing native species in a natural community, whether you're on private land or public land, you have certain goals, and common goals that you see for natural community management, natural land management, is that you would want to preserve or enhance any existing significant ecological features and functions on the site, right? You want that site to perform well, to function as it should. You want to restore or recreate natural communities. So you want populations of native species and assemblages that were kind of naturally found on the ecosystem, whether that's a prairie restoration or something. And you want to promote and protect and establish native species in these natural communities, right? So that's kind of what we want to do with natural community management, whether it's private or public land. Even if it's in a small scale of a small little prairie planting in your side yard. So we like these native habitats and native landscapes that are dominated by intact natural communities and native species. And we utilize management to kind of work towards that and meet those goals. And so invasive species can impact our ability to obtain those goals. So if we revisit those goals that we had, those three goals for why we protect and manage natural communities, we can see how invasive species impact those goals. So that first goal of preserving and enhancing the significant ecological features or the functions on a site, we know that invasive species really can alter ecological functioning. They can change hydrology on a site. They can change the nutrient cycling ability in the soil. They can change the fire regime on a site. And so these functioning ecosystems are altered or changed in significant ways at times from invasive species. And if we look at things like Phragmites, which is a wetland grass that can so dominate a wetland that it can literally lower the water table in it, or cheatgrass, or some of these invasive grasses in drier sites that change the flammability of ecosystems, or even bush honeysuckle, which leaves are so good at picking up moisture when they fall off the plant. They basically create a blanket on the soil that reduces its ability to dry out, and so you have less fire in a forest with when you have bush honeysuckle in there in systems that really need fire or are naturally fire prone. And so goal number two, we know that we want to restore or recreate natural communities full of native species. And we know that invasive species can alter habitat structure, species dominance or evenness, increase cost of management, impact forage, nesting, our habitat quality, right? So we go from having an ecosystem that's not really dominated by any one species, but instead has an assemblage of species that are all at somewhat even levels and kind of spread throughout the system, to going from that to having that whole system be dominated by one or two, exotic invasive species. And that really does change that habitat structure uh, of a system. And I talk about it a lot when I talk about invasive species, how I think an impact that's often overlooked is the homogenization of the landscape. And so if you walk through forest full of high quality native species, you may find suites of species that are in the bottomlands, trilliums, if you will, or bloodroot and things like that. And as you go up into the slopes, you're going to transition into other native species, maybe Dutchman's breeches or other things. And then if you go upslope even farther, you're going to transition into drier species, and that may be our native um, species, like whether it's mayapple or some even drier species like woodreed, or just a lot of the native species that you would find, monardus and things in the uplands. And so you get this landscape that's really diverse as you walk through it. And the problem with invasive species is, bush honeysuckle, for example, can grow in all of those habitats and then suddenly dominates all those habitats. So as you walk through this forest and go through these transition zones, they now all look the same. They're all now dominated by the same exotic species. That's what I'm talking about with homogenizing the landscape, which is really unfortunate and a big impact that doesn't get talked about a lot. And then lastly, our goal for natural land management: to protect, promote, or establish populations of native species. We all know all too well that these invasives can directly impact native species, reduce population sizes, even hybridize with natives in some cases. And then that leads to local extirpations, right? We lose species off the landscape. We lose species diversity. We lose sometimes planting success when we try to plant a native prairie and it gets overrun with reed canary grass, or we try to plant a forest and it gets overrun with autumn olive, something like that, right? So there's some big changes, unfortunately, in terms of our ability to manage and protect our native ecosystems due to invasive species. And this is kind of exacerbated even in this kind of urban-rural interface, or this wildland-urban interface, whatever you want to call it, because our natural habitats in these systems tend to be smaller, more fragmented. They may be habitat islands, or maybe they're connected via corridors. But overall, we see, more edge, more disturbance in these smaller habitats in this kind of urban-rural interface or wildland-urban interface. And that kind of only increases the impact to invasive species. We also often see complex land ownership patterns where we have parcel sizes are really small, and that complicates trying to manage these invasive species at any kind of scale that's ecologically relevant. Impacts from climate change is exacerbated in these kind of environments, simply because they have less ability to migrate and move through. The species do. So if you lose a species out of a small island of natural habitat, since it's less connected, and through climate change, we lose that species, they're less likely to come in, or maybe the invasive species or impacts are more impacted in these areas simply because the species are not going to be able to migrate to adjust to climate change. And then finally, we get a lot more invasive plant pressure from these areas. We often have a lot of edge habitat. A lot of invasives are even used in plantings, or we get unmanaged areas, roadsides, and things like that kind of serve as seed sources for these invasives. And so when you look at this kind of wildland urban interface, you do get residential areas, industrial areas, travel corridors, all mixed in with native habitats. And that just makes it a challenge, sometimes, and kind of a unique challenge to invasives. And there was a couple interesting studies that looked at this that kind of highlights it. And one study was looking at, this was out of Ohio, but really, really interesting, looking at the role that horticulturally planted colliery pears, the different varieties like Bradford and all those, what role they play in the escaped populations, the infestations of coleorepair in native areas adjacent. And so they did a bunch of genetic work, and they basically found that every variety of coleorepair that was planted even remotely close to this little pocket of native habitat genetically contributed to the invasive coleorepair in this habitat. So it really was interesting that the genes were flowing from the planted trees into the escaped trees, and it wasn't just one, it was all the different varieties together. So really, really interesting work showing um, kind of how the planting choices of residential folks have influenced the native habitat adjacent. And then just some other studies out there, right? So they found that roads, edges of habitats really influence where these invasive shrubs are found. So more roads, more edge habitat, smaller smaller sizes of forest led to more invasive species. High deer populations interact with species like garlic mustard, and that to actually kind of have a feedback loop and even put more pressure on the native plants, because as the native plants become less and less abundant, the deer seek them out more and the impacts are even higher. And then this is actually my thesis work here, way back in the day now. I did this at Iowa State, and I looked at how are woodlands in Iowa are spatially arranged? Like what's their edge? What's their connectivity? How does that influence invasive species, abundance and severity of invasion? And no surprise that the more dissected, the more narrow, the more edge habitat we found in these woodlands spatially or in the landscape spatially, the more invasive species we had, right? And so again, this all is kind of heightened in problem when you get into this kind of interface within residential urban areas, suburban areas with natural lands. And so we do have some best management practices, if you will, some things that we can do to kind of help manage these invasive species or reduce their impacts, particularly in this interface. And so I got a few of these. It's not groundbreaking. I'm sure you guys all already do this, but it's worth talking about. And the first best management practice is just what you all promote. Stop using invasive species in landscaping. Switch to non-invasive, more importantly, native alternatives in our intentional plantings. And we've had a long and sordid history with invasive species, and most of the problems that we have with invasives are frankly self-inflicted, right? At first, it was for agriculture or wildlife. So these are some handouts out there that I like to collect, talking about why you should plant multiflora rose as a living fence, how good autumn olive is for wildlife, and how good Sericea lespedeza is for erosion control, right? So these were brought over thinking they're the next best thing, and we're actually adding diversity to our ecosystems, and they would bring a lot of benefits, right? And we didn't. The folks that brought them over didn't realize the problems that were going to come from them. But horticulture is also one of those issues. And in fact, for woody invasive plants in North America, it's the major one. About over 80% of the woody invasive species in North America were introduced for horticultural purposes. So this is a big issue and a big source of a lot of our invasive species. And we know that, right? We mentioned coleorepair earlier, but we see it on the roadside like this. Unfortunately escaped, or this is an interesting Google Earth photo that you look at, just taken just at the right time of year, and you can see all of the coleorepair spreading out into this landscape, which I thought was interesting. And so we still have a number of invasive species that are still used, right? You can still buy them, you can plant them, and people are planting them. And this is just a small subset of those, right? Norway maples, barberries, burning bushes, winter creepers, English ivy, cork tree, coleorepair, golden bamboo, and you could just keep going, right? So unfortunately, there's a list of species that are still available that you can plant, and the idea is to not plant those and then switch to something non-invasive, or again, more importantly, native if you can. And so there's a lot of resources out there if you're interested in doing that. Working with groups like the Native Plant Society, Wild Ones groups for sure. Or there's some interesting things. So there's the Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes Collaborative that's out there, and they have landscape alternatives to invasive species that are still found in the trade. And so it's a real neat publication, a real neat website out there, and it basically highlights other things that are non-invasive and things that are native to use instead of some of these invaders. And so that is a neat website. There's other websites out there. The Midwest Invasive Plant Network has those. And so these are just resources that people can use along with, Wild Ones material and other groups to promote these non-invasive and these native alternatives to invasive species, right? Other ones, best management practice one would be to manage these corridors, right? Manage areas, the green spaces, the low maintenance areas, the edges, the corridor areas, the old fields, the abandoned lots. These places provide refugia for invasive species that can be propagular sources to spread into higher quality habitats. And so by managing these sites, managing fence rows along backyards and things like that, it allows to kind of reduce the pressure. And we've all seen this, right? So this is Tree of Heaven in an urban forest block. This happens to be in the Czech Republic, but you could also easily be in Chicago, right? So these kind of habitats. Teasel here along a roadside. Canada thistle in an urban park. All these different sites. Right, these are sites that we can focus on. So we're reducing, even if they're low quality, we're reducing this propagular pressure, the seed source, so that it's less likely to move into our higher quality habitats or on our private lands. And then kind of lastly, in this best management practice side of things, we can educate and involve landowners and the public doing advocacy work and education work like Wild Ones does is so important to get out there and show people kind of the consequences of their actions and what they plant, give them concrete steps to move forward to kind of better the situation, right? And so this is a youth group here, a YCC group planning native pollinator gardens at a public office, which I think is really awesome. Installation of boot brushes as a great way at trailheads. It's a great way to educate folks. I really like throwing this in here for two reasons. One, that is my boot right there, which I think is kind of cool. That made it into a story on the Outdoor Illinois, that old magazine that when it was still in print. So my boot made the cover model, and then the picture on the right is my daughter. And so I always try to sneak pictures in of kids when I can. Now, she's 15 now, so this picture is a little bit old, but kind of fun, right? So these boot brushes. And so those are kind of some of the generic best management practices. What I wanted to spend the rest of the time on is really what we're here today, is talking about controlling invasive plants, right? And so this would be our goal for controlling invasive plants, is to reduce, prevent, or eliminate these negative impacts, right? We want to work over time and reduce those negative impacts or prevent them, especially if we can. And so there's some resources out there for you if you really want to dig into this. I would highlight the Extension Forestry, which is the group that I work with, our information. So we have a website listed there. We have a YouTube channel with a lot of different presentations, many of those on invasive species. We produced the Management of Invasive Plants and Pest of Illinois guide that gives you a lot of the recommendations of how to kill things, basically. That same group, the Woody Invasives Collaborative, has a lot of management and control information on their website, which is great. And then there's a neat little website out there that I use a lot called the Midwest Invasive Plant Network's Control Database. And so this one, you hop on there and you type in the name of the plant you're interested in, and it gives you a lot of information kind of separated by expertise. So if you're only interested in mechanical means and non-chemical means, or you're somebody that's more, you consider an amateur, you can kind of check those boxes and it would give you information for those, or maybe you're an expert, or maybe you're somebody that has access to herbicides or equipment, you can check those boxes and just get a whole wealth of information on that website. So those are some just basic resources. So let's get into some of the techniques that I think you as homeowners or volunteers that you're more likely to do. And so I'm going to start kind of at the most simple level, right? The mechanical treatment level, and then kind of work up into some other treatments as well. But mechanical treatments, you're really physically removing or at least damaging those plants, right? And so for perennial plants, you want to do a full removal if you can. Sometimes for annual or biennial plants, if the timing's right, just damaging them stops them from producing seed. But that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about herbicides here. We're talking about physical, mechanical control of these plants. And there's several things that kind of fall into this area, right? And so hand pulling is one of them, right? And so that's nice because there's really no tools needed other than gloves. And hand pulling, this happened to be a round leaf bittersweet work day where we pulled young vines through a forest, but it's kind of the classic thing that we do for garlic mustard and volunteer days, right? So hand pulling is a common technique that's used in invasive species control, and it has positives and it has negatives. And so the positives for hand pulling, it's good for volunteer days. There's no training, no licensing needed, or very little training and no licensing needing, no real capacity issue. If you get a ton of people, you can put them to work hand pulling stuff, right? Because all they need is a pair of gloves. It works on a lot of the species. So small diameter woody plants, annuals or biennials, running vines like winter creeper, it can work on, and you can really get some positive work. So there's definitely some good situations where hand pulling works well. There are some negatives to hand pulling, right? It has limited applicability to larger woody plants. You just can't grab them by the hand and get them out of the ground. There is potential for ineffectiveness. If you try to do something and you end up breaking the stem or breaking the root, that plant could grow back, and so you're not actually removing it. And also, if you're doing this at a time when the fruit are ripe or the seeds are falling, there's a potential for transferring or spreading these invasive plants around if it's done at the wrong time. And there's promotes soil disturbance. When you're hand pulling these things, you're disturbing the soil, and that could express more seeds or have an avenue for other invasive species to move in. So there are some negatives to hand pulling. Kind of moving up, mechanical or pulling aids. So this is for taking the next level up where you can't hand pull things, but you can use these pulling aids to increase the size of plants that you're able to mechanically remove. And so there's a bunch of different ones out there. They've got the craziest names. I really think they're just trying to compete with each other for the weirdest names. There's things called like weed wrench, extractigator, polar bears, honeysuckle poppers, all kinds of different names out there, but they all basically work on the same principle, as that they're giving you some level of mechanical leverage over the plants by having a long handle and a fulcrum down there close to the plant, and you're kind of concentrating all that work of pushing that down into a small area and pulling these plants out. Some positive with that, this is another one that's good for volunteers, right? There's very little training, and no licensing needing. You just need to show people how to identify the plant and then how to go about yanking it out of the ground, or how to go about using these things. It works on many woody species, particularly shallow rooted species like honeysuckle, or small diameter stemmed invasive species and woody species. It works pretty well. And it works in a lot of situations, right? Loose, uncompacted soils, times when you have adequate soil moisture, it can work really well. So this is another good one for volunteer days, or somebody that doesn't want to deal with herbicides, or somebody that has a kind of incipient infestation that's just starting and is mostly small diameter plants. It can work. It does have some negatives. These pulling aids are heavy, right? So it causes fatigue as you're working with them. I always joke that it's a great tool for somebody else to use because they can get heavy over time. And it doesn't work on all species, right? Large diameter stems, it doesn't work on. Deep-rooted species like autumn olive tend to break instead of getting pulled out. So it does have situations where it's just not an effective tool. And it doesn't work in some situations, even on the right species. When you have dry or compacted soils, you tend to have root breakage in those situations as well. And then it very much promotes soil disturbance. And so those are some of the negatives that you would have with utilizing these pulling aids. Another mechanical method is growth suppression aids. And so these are things that you can do to solarize invasive species or keep them from growing and wear them out through just preventing them by shading them out. And so it might be weed mat, it might be tarps laid down, and it could be the things like buckthorn baggies where you cut the plant down and zip tie that over the stump. These kind of all work in the same way where you're restricting those invasives from the space or the light that they need to grow, or sometimes you're increasing the heat to kind of damage them that way. These growth suppression aids have some positives, right? They can work in a lot of different situations. They're mostly inexpensive. You can often reuse them, and there's a lot of different options out there for you. They're also good for volunteers. They do take some training to understand how to use them effectively, how to put them in there, but there's no licensing issues, no permitting issues. The negatives are it doesn't work in every situation, particularly when you have like mixed stands with natives mixed with invasives, sometimes that you just can't put them in there at the scale you need to. And then you're also leaving sometimes materials like plastic materials and things on site in the natural environment for a long time. And those can break down or become litter if you don't get back to them in time. So there are some negatives to these growth suppression aids. But those are some of the kind of mechanical means. So what I want to talk about now is more chemical means. And I think this is also an option for landowners if you're comfortable with chemicals. Herbicides is what I'm talking about, that you can use these to effectively and safely control invasive species. And there's a lot of different methods. And so I'm going to kind of spend the rest of the time talking about control methods, herbicide use of herbicide at scales that I think is really appropriate for small landowners or volunteers or folks like that. And before I talk about any chemical control, I always highlight that you have to be safe, right? So you want to use your appropriate protective gear. And generally with using herbicides, kind of minimum level of safety would be some kind of eye protection, long sleeves, long pants, closed-toed shoes, and then often chemical gloves like nitrile gloves or something that are designed to resist the chemicals on them. And so that's kind of like the minimum level of what we call PPE or personal protective equipment that you would want to wear when you're applying herbicides. And then always highlight that you have to read and follow that label. Every herbicide you buy will have a detailed label on it that gives the instructions on when you can use that, how you can use it, what species you can use it on, and like the rates you want to use. And so that's a legal document. So you should read that label and then make sure that anything you're doing with that herbicide falls within the specifications in that label. And so a lot of times the different options for herbicide can be overwhelming, right? And so instead of really highlighting all of these, I put it in here just so that way it's into recording. But the main thing is figure out the species you want to control and then look for the herbicides that work on those species. There's a lot of different herbicides out there. Some have different levels of selectivity. Some are labeled for aquatic uses. Some work on all plants. Some only work on woody plants. Some only work on grasses, right? So there's a lot of different things out there that we use. And some of them you have to be careful with because they may move in the soil. So that's why, I mean, I would say do your research when you're looking at what species that you are wanting to control, and then how to control them when you're selecting the right herbicides out there. And we have whole videos on herbicides on our YouTube channel as well. But I'm going to, instead of highlighting, just talking about all these different ones, I'm going to talk about kind of the application techniques and the tools that we use to utilize herbicides to control invasive plants. And so one of them is just a simple foliar herbicide. So that's when you spray the leaves of the plant in a very dilute solution of herbicide. Usually it's, a couple ounces of herbicide in a gallon of water, kind of that level of dilution. And you're spraying this herbicide on the leaves of the plant, and you're utilizing those leaves to take up that herbicide and transfer that herbicide in throughout the plant so that it can kill the entire plant, right? So the leaves are just the entry point for the herbicide, and that's why you use a dilute formulation, because you don't want to actually hurt the leaves at this point. You want to use them as that uptake, and then allow the herbicide to move through the plant and kill the entire thing. And so because of that, you should have healthy, actively growing foliage, the leaves, when you spray the plant, right? Because that way it's going to best take it up. If your plant's in drought stress or starting to shut down in the winter, or it's had heavy feeding from insects, or there's a lot of sooty mold on it or dust on it or something like that, that's going to inhibit the uptake of the herbicide some, and you're going to have less control. So active, healthy, green, growing vegetation is what you need to be able to kill the plants with a foliar spray. But when you're doing this, you're spraying that out across this whole foliage. I will say watch for non-target impacts. Are there other native plants that are growing close to that plant that you may overspray and accidentally hit? In general, I don't like to spray anything over about 5 or 6 feet tall because I don't want the herbicide to come back on me. And then I'll use things like shields or whatnot if there's plants next to the target plants that I don't want to impact, right? So there's ways you can get some selectivity there. So that's kind of foliar spray. The rest I'm going to talk about is this integrated methods. And so this is where you're actually combining mechanically damaging the plants with herbicide treatments. And so this is nice in the sense that you're usually having a much more targeted application than a foliar spray, where you're just painting or daubing on a little bit of herbicide to one particular part of the plant. It can be incredibly selective in the sense that you can remove an invasive plant that's immediately adjacent to native species without impacting those native species. So there's a lot of tools for this integrated methods, right, where you're doing the combo of herbicide treatment and mechanical. And so a lot of times we're looking at tools. It could be power tools like chainsaws or brush cutters, but even something as simple as a machete, a hatchet, a cordless drill, a pair of loppers can be a really a little handsaw can be really useful tools, and tools that are really appropriate to use for this type of control work. And so we'll get into these, we call them stem treatments. So this is where you're putting this more concentrated formulation of herbicide directly to the stem of the plants. So instead of spraying the leaves, you're spraying the stem or a cut surface on the stem. And so the pros to that is you're mixing less herbicide, you're carrying less herbicide, so it's a little easier that way. You're directing this application to a small area, so you don't have that overspray problem as much. They can be very effective. You should expect 90+% control when you do this. And then you have nearly a year-round application window for woody invasive plants using these methods. And then you can treat tall plants when foliar option is foliar sprays are not an option. If you have a tall tree of heaven, it's something like that, you can still treat this using these methods when you couldn't really feasibly treat the leaves. The cons to these methods, you're using a more concentrated herbicide. So if you do have a spill or you get something on you, the exposure is a slightly more risky because you're getting exposed to a higher concentrated version of the herbicide versus a more dilute version. And then if you have really dense stands, where we call them dog hair thick, right? These big stands of invasive plants that are really thick, you run the risk of kind of over applying too much herbicide in that area because you're just applying it to every one of these. So you have to kind of be careful with things like that. And then there's a few herbicides that you got to be careful because they move in the soil. So you'd want to avoid those. And that's things like Tordon, Imazapyr, that in certain situations they're great, but if you're under the drip line of desirable trees, or you're in areas where there's some sensitive plants, you wouldn't want to use those. And so there are some cons to this method as well. So what I'm going to do is just walk through the different stem treatment options and kind of what they look like and how to use them. And then we'll move on from there. And so one of the most common ones that's really available to landowners that are dealing with any size of land would be the cut stump treatment. Cut stump is really basically exactly what it sounds like. It's cutting the plant down close to the ground. and then treating that stump with herbicide to prevent it from sprouting. This works nice because it can be done on really any invasive plant of any size, woody invasive plant. So it could be a full-on tree down to little, the size of a pencil or something, shrubs. So it works really well. The tools that you would use for cut stump would be chainsaws, for some things, hand saws, little folding saws, loppers, pruning loppers, pruning things, brush axes, even sawzalls or reciprocating saws with pruning blades work really, really well for that as for cutting stuff down. So all these different kind of hand tools, um, all the way from as cheap as a pair of $20 loppers up to chainsaws work really well. And then you need some way to get the herbicide. So a hand pump spray bottle, I always call them like a 409 bottle, is one option. Daubers paintbrush. Some people use the foam paintbrushes, or like the shoe polish appliers, the little daubers. There's a lot of different things you can do for that. And those are kind of the real, not very technical tools that you would need to be able to do this. We tend to use water-based solutions of herbicide because you can use them any time of year, or you can switch to an oil-based herbicide if it's freezing outside. And you would want to treat the entire surface of small stems. So if you're like your plant you're cutting down is less than 2 inches in diameter, you would treat the whole surface. If it's bigger than that, you only have to treat kind of that outer inch or edge of it. And then I like using herbicide dye. For cut stump, I wouldn't do it in the spring because it's not effective as that plant's expanding, because it's pushing all that energy out of its roots, and you're not going to get that herbicide down into its roots. So you would wait until that full leaf expansion before using this method. And then you want to make the herbicide application within 15 minutes or so of when you cut that plant down. Any later than that, it starts to decrease the effectiveness of it. If you can't treat within 15 minutes, you can use an oil-based herbicide, and you can get a little bit more effectiveness. But overall, cut it and treat it within 10 to 15 minutes. Some other considerations, don't cut too close to the ground, because one, dirt's going to dull your saw, but also getting dirt on that cut surface can limit the herbicide uptake. You also don't want to leave the stumps too high, because they become a tripping hazard or a driving hazard if you're at the edge of a place that people may use UTVs. So I tend to aim for that like 2 to 4 inch range. That's kind of the sweet spot for me. So that way I'm not getting dirt and junk on the cut surface to reduce my uptake, but it's also not so high that I'm causing problems. And then if you got a lot of it, you got to develop a plan to handle all this downed slash, we call it, all the tops from the honeysuckle or the other woody plants that you've cut. So a lot of times when I'm working in a volunteer group, I'm working in teams of 3 to 5. You have somebody cutting, a couple people applying the herbicide, and a couple people moving and piling the slash. If you're at your house, you just work at your own pace, right? And just make sure not to get overwhelmed with the slash. Now, a cousin to cut stump is basil bark. And so basil bark is similar, but instead of cutting the plant down and putting that herbicide right there, you're actually applying the herbicide directly to the cut stem. Sorry, directly to the bark, and the bark takes it up. So this, you would have an oil-based herbicide. You would want to treat from the ground up to about 12 to 14 inches. And it uses more herbicide than a cut stump, but you don't have to cut the plants down, and it's very fast. Kind of a typical tool for this would be a backpack sprayer, or one of those hand pressurized hand sprayers. Like you pressurize them and you carry them around, like a gallon one or something, simply because you're using a little bit more herbicide. So these tools are usually the better. Again, we look for those oil-based herbicides, like Pathfinder 2 is one example, or Garlon 4. And this works well on smaller stemmed woody plants. As the plants get bigger, the bark gets thicker and it becomes less effective. So for something like autumn olive, I wouldn't want to go much more than 4 or 5 inches in diameter. Same thing for buckthorn. For something like tree of heaven, that's a little bit thinner bark, you can get a little bigger. The nice thing is it doesn't leave anything standing, right? It's so there's no slash problem. You'd want to use a low pressure sprayer so that you're not splashing the herbicide around. Instead, you're kind of dribbling it and letting it run down from the top of that 12 to 14 inch zone. So yeah, it's a good method. It works really well. We use it a lot for some of these thinner barked shrubs. And then the last kind of one of these methods are the stem injection applications. And so this is a big category that is kind of halfway between cut stump and basal bark. And I like it because you're really directing. This is probably the most directed application of herbicide. You're making small damage sites directly to the stem of the plant to expose that inner bark, and you're putting a directed application of concentrated herbicide right into that damaged site and letting it take up that way. And so these are like girdle cuts, hack and squirt, it's called, drill and fill. They have all these funny names. And so all of these stem injection tools, again, they're very directed applications. So you have very little chance for non-target impact when they're done correctly. And you could use things like a brush axe, like you see in the picture, hatchets, machetes, chainsaws, a girdle chain, which is like a chainsaw chain that's on handles, cordless drills, all these things, basically something to kind of create that damage site. And then you need like a 409 bottle hand pump sprayer to get the herbicide into that damage site. And so one is a girdle cut. So this you would completely cut around the stem deep enough to expose that inner bark and the sapwood, and then you would spray herbicide directly into that cut. So this is a big princess tree, which you all don't have in northern Illinois, but this could be the same thing for tree of heaven. You'd want to, with those girdle cuts, within a couple feet to the ground, and want to make them deep enough to get past the bark, right? And it works. This is really great for large stems, right? So tiny stems, you tend to break them, but if you got something that's 3 or 4 inches in diameter or bigger, just girdling it quickly really works well. Hack and squirt is similar, but instead of girdling the whole thing, you're making a series of downward chops, either with a machete or a hatchet. I really like a roofing shingle hammer. It seems to be small and sharp. And then you're making these downward cuts to kind of create this hack into it. And you're applying herbicide directly into that wound site. And that allows the herbicide to kind of stay in there with those downward cuts. It works really well. And then the new one that we're moving to is, we call it drill and fill. And so instead of using a hatchet or something, we're using a cordless drill with a 3/8 to a 1/2 inch drill bit. And we're just drilling at a downward angle, 1.5 to 2 inches deep into the wood, and then putting the approximately 1 milliliter or so. It says approximately, but it means 1 milliliter of herbicide in each of those holes, right, to kill the plant. Very directed, just right into that plant, and very little chance of non-target impacts. The number of holes or the number of hacks, and for a hack and squirt, kind of depends on the diameter of the stem. We'll talk about that in a second. So there's different label instructions for that, but it's very fast, leaves the plant standing, and very controlled, in the sense that very little chance of impacting other species. So we use this a lot. And so with these, they're very simple. They're portable methods. They do require a little more advanced knowledge of herbicides. You are working a little bit with concentrated herbicides, so you got to be careful with that. But it can be a very great method that doesn't require that many specialized tools for landowners that are controlling stuff on their own land. With these, often the application rate is dependent on the diameter of the stem and kind of what herbicide you're using. So you want to make sure that you know what's going on. And you have to be careful in late winter, this time of year, as things warm up. That sap flow really limits the effectiveness of this method. And so just some examples. So like if you're using glyphosate, which is Roundup, you're basically doing a 50 to 100% concentration in a frill, or you're evenly spacing those hacks, either a drill or a hack, about 1 injection for every 2 inches in diameter of the tree. For Garlon or some, another one would be 1 hack or drill for every 4 inches along the stem, and you're putting 1/2 milliliter herbicide in. So using small amounts of herbicide, right, and spreading it out that way. And so just one last thing about these different control methods. If you're treating a plant that you've cut down and it's re-sprouting, I would wait for those sprouts to get up to be 18 to 24 inches tall before treating them with herbicide. And the reason why is, when they're as small as they are in that picture, there's not enough leaf area to take up enough herbicide to kill those roots. So you want those leaves to grow up a little bit, get enough leaves on there so that you can really kill that plant. So when we're treating sprouts, give it enough time to grow just a little bit, you're going to have more effectiveness. All righty. So finishing up here, kind of understanding like what to do, right? We just talked about some control techniques and kind of went over them quickly. When you're trying to decide what you can do as a landowner or a volunteer, you really need to understand your options. What is feasible? What do you have the knowledge and the comfort level doing? What is practical? And what do you have capacity for? Are you just you and you're trying to work with yourself, or do you have availability of other help? Are you doing this for a volunteer work day, right? Because there's a very big difference in dealing with a stand that looks like this with very small diameter shrubs. This is all honeysuckle, but it's all small stuff. Kind of understanding what your options are there is very different than if you have just a few really big honeysuckle like this one, right? So your choices and what's feasible and what's practical is very different in those two situations. And then understanding what your invasive severity is. If you have small infestations, new infestations, a plant here or there, you can do these stuff that we talked about, these individual plant treatments. If you have acres and acres and acres of large, dense infestations, then you probably need to step up and look at some of these more intensive treatments like broadcast spraying or mulching with big machinery, right? So you got to kind of understand, are the techniques that you want to use, do they match the infestation that you're dealing with? And then simply, what do you have capacity for? What do you have time to do? What do you have resources? Whether that's, if you're a volunteer or on public land, staff or contractors. If it's your private land, are you going to hire somebody or do it yourself? If so, do you have the funding to do that? Do you have the training and the equipment? You kind of have to understand what your capacity is when deciding to do these. And then also just what is feasible. Is there a lot of a seed bank in there that you're just not going to be able to address? Are the adjacent landowners not controlling their invasives, and so the reinfestation is going to be another problem? What else are you trying to do on that land? So there's a lot of things you have to kind of think about when you're deciding how to deal with these invasive species. And then just lastly, what are your priorities, right? So is this an established or incipient infestation? Or, is it one that's been there forever? Or is it actively spreading? I would say the actively spreading infestations, ones that are moving through, should be higher priority. Or is there a resource at risk? Do you have a rare native species on your land? Do you have an intact natural area that you want to maintain? Or have you put a lot of money into a tree planting that you don't want to see fail? Those are some of the things that can increase the priority of a situation. And so ultimately, I like to always end, and I know I went over this quick, but I wanted to make sure that I really left a little bit of time for questions here. I love this quote from the Nature Conservancy that says, "We control invasive species because they are harming the native plants and animals that we care so much about protecting." And to me, that's a great summary of why we control invasive species. If they didn't do damage, we wouldn't control them. But they are doing damage, and that's why because we want to promote our native species and our native ecosystems. And so with that, just for a minute here, I'll leave this slide up because it has my email address there on it. And so if you do want to email me or anything like that, feel free to. I'll stick it in chat as well. And then with that, I think I'll stop sharing here in a second and then open it up to questions people have or comments or anything like that. I'll go ahead and stop sharing and I'll just put my email in the chat, and that way we can all see each other.
Also, in the chat, I put a link to a web page for the Greater DuPage Wild Ones. We have a nice resource page, a page about invasives on our website, and that's in the chat. If anyone would like to click on it and make it a favorite, then you can look at it later.
Fantastic. That's a great resource.
If anyone has a question, one question was typed in, a couple questions were typed in the Q&A. Otherwise, you can unmute yourself to ask a question. You don't have to raise your hand or anything. Looks like most people don't want to ask questions, but the one that was typed in asks, what's the best time of year to treat roundleaf bittersweet? And
Okay.
typically how many treatments are needed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So roundleaf bittersweet is a challenging one, and the reason why it's challenging is because it's a clonal species. And if you're familiar with that species, it can be connected underground with this large root network that so if you damage a plant or injure one of them, it could stimulate this root suckering, and you can get this massive response that just complicates the situation. So when I like to control round leaf bittersweet, is it can be done almost any time of the year, but it's really more the method I think is more important than the timing. Is on vines that are any size at all that you can't just spray the foliage. I like to do what's called a basal bark, and so that's what we mentioned there, where you're spraying that herbicide, an ester-based herbicide, right to the bark. And what that does is it basically doesn't send a signal to that plant that it's been mechanically damaged and it needs to sucker. So instead, it kind of takes up that herbicide and it'll kill it. And it takes a while to kill it, but you'll really reduce the amount of suckering you see and the amount of kind of thicket forming that you'll see after that. And so usually it takes a couple, three treatments because it's such a heavy root system. But I would treat not in the spring. I would wait till it's either fully leafed out or I would treat in the fall. Fall is generally my favorite time to treat it because you can really see it and then there's not a lot of native plants green. Or even early winter, and then just see what comes back and then treat it the next year. And you might have to do that a couple times.
Jill has a question. Jill, you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Yeah, I did unmute. Can you hear me?
Sure
Yes.
can.
Okay. I do have a question. I had Davy Tree come out and take out uh half a dozen fairly, well, not huge, maybe 2 to 3 inch in diameter honeysuckle and a couple other things they cleaned up. But I'm concerned about those honeysuckle because they they did that um about 6 weeks ago. They removed it. Um, and they said they were coming back to treat it. And you just said springtime is not a good time to um treat it with herbicides. So I'm thinking, what's the best thing they
Yeah,
can do?
yeah. So a couple things. One, I wouldn't generally recommend cutting it and then coming back later and treating it. I would want to do those at the same time. If they do cut it and then come back later and treat it, I would want to use an oil-based herbicide. So an oil-based herbicide, basically that it uses bark oil or something they call it, and it basically holds the herbicide onto that cut stump and that surface of that plant kind of longer and gives it more time to slowly take up that herbicide. And generally we don't like that. We like a water herbicide because it gets moves in there really fast. But when that plant has been cut and then left to sit there for, a few weeks, it's going to compartmentalize that damage. It's going to kind of shut down those cells. And so you need a long residence time for that herbicide to be taken up. I think we're getting close to the time, at least in Southern Illinois, where we want to stop treating the woody plants because they're starting to grow. I think in Northern Illinois, you've got a little bit of time still yet before we really start seeing the honeysuckle buds swell and start growing. But we are kind of getting to that time of year where I think we should kind of halt treatments of woody plants for a while until they fully leaf out. And so for now, for you, if they're going to come back and treat them, I would hope they would do it soon and then just watch them this year. And if they sprout and they didn't die, then I would have them come back and finish the job they didn't do, basically.
Yeah. Well, would it help to recut the surface where
It,
they are cut?
if you've got space to do it, right? So if they
Yeah.
cut it a little high and you can go down below that cut surface a little bit and then
Mhm.
recut it, that can help. It can kind of freshen up those cells and give you fresher cells that may enhance herbicide uptake. Yes,
Thank you very much.
no
Thanks.
problem. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Somebody typed in a question. What's the best herbicide to use on reed canary grass?
Oh, reed canary grass is a tough one. So there's a couple options, but what I've liked to do, so reed canary grass, one is it often forms layers of thatch down there, and so that thatch layer can inhibit herbicide uptake because you've got a lot of dead plants that aren't taking the herbicide up, and they're just capturing or intercepting the herbicide. So what we like to do is either mow it cut it, burn it if you can. If you can't, that's not an option. You can't do it. But if you can, you do that and then let it grow back a little bit. You let it grow up to 2 feet tall, something like that. And what that does is it gives you fresher, newer foliage that maybe doesn't have as much of a waxy cuticle, and you've removed a lot of that thatch, so it's not going to intercept your herbicide, and then you treat it. So we treat it often with what's called rodeo, or it's aquatic safe glyphosate. And so aquatic safe glyphosate, because reed canary grass is often grown in wetland environments. So you don't want to use anything that is damaging to aquatic ecosystems. So anything that you would want to use in those environments should have a label that says it's safe for use in aquatic systems. And then even just straight, yeah, glyphosate, which is the aquatic label glyphosate called rodeo or aquaneat. There's a bunch of versions. Works pretty well, but it's going to take multiple treatments. Now, if you have other plants in there that's mixed in, it's going to kill those as well. So you'd want to be careful in your treatment and try to avoid any desirable plants.
Same person asked about that they heard that basil bark can be used year round. Do you recommend not using it during spring?
Basil bark can be, generally, if you read the label, it'll say it can be used year round, even in that spring green up period. I think I would still, if you can avoid that green up period, I think you'll have better success. But yeah, basil bark overall, if you read the label, says it's year round, you can use it. Me personally, based on my experience when I've used it, I would stay away from the spring green up. I think you're going to have better luck.
Another person asked about a situation here. Suggestion for removing a honeysuckle from the middle of an arrowwood viburnum.
Sure. So that's a situation where you want to be extremely directed in any application. So if it's in the middle, if it's a small honeysuckle and you can mechanically remove it, that's great. If it's a larger honeysuckle and that's not really an option, or the arrowwood viburnum is just growing so densely around it that you can't, then I would probably look at getting a lopper in there or getting something and just cutting that down and using a dauber or a paint sponge or something like that, and then just treating that cut surface of that honeysuckle and just taking care not to get the rest of it. And I would use something like glyphosate, which really needs to have a lot of contact with the plant to kill it. And I think you can do that and safely remove the one while retaining the other. It's just, it takes a little bit of care that you're not going to overspray or something.
Someone asked for clarification about cutting out invasive honeysuckle. Is she supposed to wait till it starts to leaf out?
No, so
or after it's leafed out?
Yeah, so with honeysuckle, once the buds in the spring, the buds start swelling right before they open up. So at that point, the juices are flowing in that plant. And then overall, your goal is to kill the root system of that plant. So if the roots are pushing the energy of that plant away from the roots, it's not going to take up that herbicide very well. So once you start seeing those buds elongate or start to swell or get bigger, from that point on until that kind of flush of leaf growth in the spring, that elongation of the stems, and you get all that new leaf growth, from the bud swell to the flush of growth, that period is ineffective at controlling honeysuckle. So I would not do any, wouldn't cut it, wouldn't treat it at that period of time, because you'll have less success. And there's been some studies where normally you should have 90% control or plus, where 9 out of 10 trees, shrubs that you cut and treat should die. If you do it at that time of year, you do stuff, you're going to push it down. You're still going to kill a lot of them, but you're going to be in that 40 to 60% success rate, and you're going to have to come back anyway. So I would say that period between bud swell and the end of the full leaf flush, that period is when you don't want to do the control. But anytime outside of that period can work well.
Chris, I had a question for you. You didn't mention controlled burns at all. Some of us do small burns in our yard, mostly in the spring, to get rid of the previous year's old plants.
Mm-hmm.
And that has some effect on controlling invasives coming in, does it not?
Oh, it absolutely does. And it's very depending on the species. And so there's whole documents. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a whole big document on invasive plants and fire. And there's actually a website called the Fire Effects Information System, FEIS, that has a lot of native plants, but a ton of invasive plants too. And so it's very varied. It's hard to generalize, but as you know, and as you just mentioned, that fire is a great management tool that promotes a lot of our natives. Overall, it can promote some invasives too. So things like Sericea lespedeza, it scarifies its seeds and causes it to germinate more, and it really promotes it. And other things, it can be a tool to use to kind of knock them back. So we often use prescribed fire to top kill a lot of honeysuckle, and then we can come back in and treat it afterwards. It's a good way of keeping autumn olive out of prairies if you do repeated treatments. And so it's hard to say, like, generalize again, like how good of a tool it is, because it really depends on the situation and the species. But it absolutely is something that can be effective. You just need to make sure it's right for the species that you're dealing with. But we use it a lot for a lot of them, like multiflora rose, Japanese honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, a lot of those. Now, the ones you want to stay away from, and there's been some research out there, is tree of heaven. Tree of heaven, they found that it does top kill. Fire can top kill it, but it'll sucker like crazy afterwards, and actually cause a bigger problem. Black locust, same thing. For that, round leaf bittersweet, another one that you've got to be really careful with prescribed fire because it can cause a bigger problem. And then even things like Canada thistle, sometimes you can cause it to move around a little bit too. So you've got to be careful on what you have. On our website, our YouTube channel, if you go to YouTube and type in Illinois Extension Forestry, Kevin Rowling, who's my colleague here, he's also an extension specialist, has a whole presentation on invasive plants and fire, and it's a great presentation.
Oh, that's good to know. Uh, you had mentioned fire effects on nature systems.
Yeah, that's my
What?
accent. Sorry. It's Fire Effects Information System,
Oh,
FEIS. Yeah, yeah. I've got my West Virginia accent. Sometimes I'm hard to understand.
um, just wanted to mention that a lot of well, homeowners don't have large areas that they've got of infestation that they have to get rid of. They're worried about a particular buckthorn that's growing
Sure.
or whatever. And um, in the back of my property, it's kind of thick with different things. And what I've done is I found it was too big of a job to cut all the buckthorns down and then haul them away. So I left them standing. I just went around and girdled with a hatchet
Hmm.
all the way around, deep enough to get through the in past the that top bark layer and the layer just underneath it that has the pores that go up and down, and that will kill the tree.
Yeah,
Now I have to
absolutely.
go back every now and then in case it starts suckering up something just below that cut, and I just chop that off. But after about continuing that for a summer, the whole tree is just dead,
Sure.
and it
Absolutely.
stays up for woodpeckers or whatever. Uh, and the main thing is buckthorn has so many seeds that it produces. I wanted to kill that top part of the tree before the berries came out.
Absolutely.
And that seemed to reduce the amount of buckthorn that was in the area that doing that. Although you always get it in because birds bring it in.
Yeah. No, and that's right. That's a good thing to highlight in the sense that these stumps can take repeated treatments, and then focusing on those fruit producing ones is a great strategy if you have a lot of plants, because then you're reducing that seed set. Absolutely. And I do see we have a question in the chat about using stem injection method for bittersweet. You absolutely can, and I've done that, and it works really well. A lot of times the bittersweet's too small in diameter, and it's kind of hard to do a stem injection, but for those bigger ones, you certainly can do that. And I see a question there about dead buckthorn. Does it still have the chemical that is bad for the toads and reptiles? I'm not as familiar with that in terms of I mean the plant's dead and it's not going to be producing those chemicals anymore. I don't know if as it rots and dies, if it exudes any latent chemicals. I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
Oh,
And,
yeah, and I'll have a similar question is there's a lot of bad plants that are sold by nurseries. And do you think that it would be there should be more regulations on nurseries to prohibit them from selling invasives
yeah,
or plants that are invasive?
I do, right? So there's a couple ways to answer that question in particular. So one, I think there's a lot of value in having nurseries and plant sellers, I guess you would say, not even nurseries producers, but people that just sell plants, know that what the demand is out there. And so as a homeowner to say, hey, I see that you've got burning bush in here, and I let you know that I'm disappointed because burning bush is a known invasive, and I really don't want to see seeing that. And the more they hear that, I think that message gets across to them because they're plant people like we are. That being said, there is definitely a place for regulations. So in the state of Illinois, we have several different regulations that deal with invasive plants. The most applicable to what we're talking about today is called the Illinois Exotic Weed Act, and so that prohibits sale, transport, planting, so forth and so on, of anything that's on that list. And so that list is pretty small right now. In 2015, we led a big effort, and I was part of that, to add about 24 new species. It was a lot of the low-hanging fruit, the honeysuckles and things like that, the teasels and knotweeds. But now, currently, we have a group in Illinois called the Illinois Invasive Species Council. So that's a statewide group that serves as an advisory council to DNR and Department of Ag. And within that group, there's a committee that deals with invasive terrestrial plants. And so I actually chair that committee. And what we're doing now is going through formal assessments of invasive plants and then formally recommending to the state what we think should happen. And that includes regulation. And so we're at this point, we've assessed 6 or 8 plants so far. One of those right now is colliery pear, and I see the question right there in the chat about colliery pear. And so we've assessed that plant. We're waiting on the final vote from the full council, but I'll tell you right now that the assessment came out as we recommend it for regulation. And so if that gets approved through the full council, which I'm very confident it will, that'll be our official recommendation to DNR, and DNR would have to take action upon that. There's a bill right now in the state that's been introduced that amends the Exotic Weed Act to allow DNR to add species more easily. Right now, it has to be a legislative act, and every species added has to be a new bill. They would rather be able to do that through ad rules, so that way they can adjust and add things a little more quickly. So that bill's in being introduced right now. If that goes through, it's going to be a lot more flexible, in my opinion. Even though I can't promote one legislation over another in my job. I'm just saying that flexibility to be able to react to new species and add species easier, I think, is going to be a good thing. So that's kind of where we're at right now. The question about colliery pear and would it be useful? I think it would be useful. You can talk to your local legislators that you don't like colliery pear, and I think that's only going to help, when things come up to a vote. So I think, but I'm very happy right now with the direction we're going, where we have this formal system that's actually partnering with the green industry, partnering with the nurseries to assess these plants and recognize them as invasive and take action. So I think we're in a pretty good spot right now, and I'm hoping that Illinois will catch up to some of the adjacent states because of that.
We're getting toward the end here. Jill has another question. Go ahead, Jill. Why don't you ask it?
Well, just speaking of your list of plants that would be regulated, I have heard that cottonwood trees are not being sold in nurseries, or they're not even allowed for a homeowner to plant. Is that true?
So that's not true on a statewide level. Cottonwoods are native. They can certainly be planted at a statewide level. In terms of a local municipality, I don't know the answer to that. My guess is there may be some that regulate them because of the cotton that flies in the spring can kind of be a nuisance. And so I'd imagine that there might be some places that do that, but no, cottonwood is a native species, at least Populus deltoides, the eastern cottonwood is a native species to Illinois across the entire, found in every county in the state. And it is not regulated at all on a state level. So if it is regulated, what you're talking about, it would have to be at a municipality level. And I haven't actually heard of that, but I'm guessing if that happens, it would be because of the cotton and being a public nuisance.
Thank you. I like cottonwood trees.
Oh, I like them too. You know, the biggest tree in the state of Illinois is a cottonwood in Ogle County.
Thank you.
There's a couple questions in chat. I'll just roll through them because I know we're getting towards the end. Can a homeowner buy Garlon or Rodeo without an applicator's license? Yes, with the exception of Garlon 3. Garlon 3 is what's considered a restricted herbicide because it has a risk of eye damage. So that was one that you have to have a license to buy. But the Rodeo, which is a glyphosate, it's a aquatic safe Roundup. It is unrestricted. It's a caution level herbicide, and anybody can buy it. And then somebody had a question about Japanese knotweed. People buried knotweed to dispose of it when trying to treat it by repeated cutting and mowing. Does this work? You can try to solarize it. You can bury it under mulch, or you can try to bury it under tarps. It has some effectiveness, but it takes a while. So I've seen knotweed basically break through tarps and then push up through even heavy mulch. So it can work, but it would take a pretty heavy material, I think, and you would want to leave it on there for a couple years because knotweed has an unbelievable root system.
I want to thank Chris for his presentation today. We're at 8:30, so the meeting's about to end. Thanks everybody for attending, and keep reading the emails.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you, Chris.